and we have some special guests with us tonight. We have Eric Schiltz, who is the campaign coordinator, and Dave Burrick. No, that's Bicking, chairman for the Committee of Professional Policing in Minneapolis. So, welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Did I say Schiltz or Schiltz?
Schiltz.
Schiltz, there we go. All
Yep,
right.
and Dave Bicking.
Right.
Dave Bicking.
That's right.
All right.
So I'm kind of scrolling through to find my notes here. So, like I said, you guys are from the Committee for Professional Policing, and you guys are out of Minneapolis, right?
Yeah, correct.
So can you give us a little rundown of what you guys do?
Yeah, so the Committee for Professional Policing is a fairly new political committee that was set up about a year ago, basically to facilitate a charter amendment campaign that we're working on right now. And basically the premise of this campaign is that currently in Minneapolis and in most cities across the country, the city is self-indemnified, meaning that when cops beat people up in the street or they're convicted of, misconduct, found guilty of that in court, and there's a lawsuit, the taxpayers pay for that lawsuit. So obviously there's just a lot of us in Minneapolis who think that's incredibly bogus, that, cops could be doing all these awful things and that taxpayers are paying for it. So the premise of our campaign is that cops each would have to buy professional liability insurance to cover those lawsuits and complaints so that they would be held individually accountable for those acts of brutality. So that's the basic premise of the campaign.
We have talked quite a few times on how much the city has shelled out over the past few years. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. In the past 7 years, Minneapolis has paid out $20 million in lawsuits for police brutality and misconduct. And we're talking a city of 380,000 people, so I think that's a pretty outstanding number. And what's worse is that the vast majority of those officers have not been disciplined. And one of the biggest things that we're talking about is, in what other area of employment can you cost your employer over $1 million in lawsuits and keep your job because of bad behavior? But that's exactly what's going on in Minneapolis. So yeah, not only is it a huge insult to all the people who've been hurt or who've been harassed, but it's just an insult to all the taxpayers. So
where do you guys stand currently in this project?
Well, we're in a process of petitioning to get this question on the ballot in the November 2014 election. So we're educating people and we're going out with petitions. We have to get about 15,000 signatures to have enough valid signatures to qualify for the ballot. One of the beauties of this is that the city government and politicians will just never stand up and do the right thing in the face of the police federation. And this is a method to enact this without the cooperation of the politicians or the city government. Because if we get enough signatures on this petition, there has to be a referendum, which would then change the city charter, which is like the city's constitution. And that would require the city to enact this new policy where our police would have their own insurance. So we've set up this committee. It was initiated by a local group, Communities United Against Police Brutality, which has been around for about 14 years and has done a lot of good work in the area of policing here. But we've been frustrated year after year after year by city inaction or methods the city has set up supposedly to discipline the police that result in no discipline or virtually none. So we're stepping up to do something different than what's been done before. There's a few precedents for it, but it's pretty much an innovative solution, and it's attracted attention from people across the country already, such as your radio show. So we're thrilled by that.
Yeah, we had, like I said, we've talked about all the payouts that Minneapolis has shelled out over the past few years, but we've also talked about why aren't cops personally liable for what they do when, like you said, every other profession, if you cost your employer $1 million in lawsuits, you're most likely not going to be working there anymore. And if you're like a doctor or nurse or something, you're personally liable for your actions, but for some reason police are not. So I think this is an awesome idea, and I really hope you guys succeed, because I would love to see this start to cascade throughout the country.
Yep.
Yeah, that's our hope. And I mean, police are city employees, and most city employees are not liable for what they do while they're at work. And I mean, in general, an employer should cover an employee who's doing the work that they're supposed to do for the city. But these cases that result in these lawsuits are when the police are going far beyond the scope of their duties for the city. They're violating city policy, they're violating laws, they're violating basic human decency, of course. But when a case arises like that, the city shouldn't be responsible, the taxpayers shouldn't be responsible when the police do something like that. So it's not to cover honest errors, accidents, that kind of thing that can happen from any employee, even a police officer of goodwill. But when the police officers know that they are going beyond their supposed duties, and that they know that this is going to hurt people, and they do it in a malicious fashion, then that is not the thing that it was ever intended for your employer to cover. So that's the difference, and it makes it a little hard because people feel, well, employees should be covered by their employer, and yes, in general they should. But you remember that most police cases where there's suits against police officers, if the police officer was following police policy, you'll never win that lawsuit anyhow. It's only generally where police have engaged in, say, excessive force. Not just force, but excessive force, meaning force beyond what they're allowed to do in the scope of their employment, that there even is a lawsuit. And those are exactly the cases where they should not be covered by the city. And the city, by state law and here and in most places, isn't actually required to cover employees when they go beyond the scope of their duty. But they elect to do that. Virtually always the city will come in and make the payment. And without the officers having their own insurance, that's a good thing, because otherwise the victim wouldn't get compensated. Most police officers can't come up with a $500,000 payment. So it's important, as it stands, for the city to come in and take that responsibility. But the responsibility ought to be on the officer. And what we're saying is, in cases where the city isn't required to cover them as an employee, they are prohibited from covering them, and the officer's insurance would take care of it. And because the officer has insurance, then the victim does have some way to get compensation.
All right. Now, I have a question for you guys.
Yeah.
Sure.
What actually? Because I know we've discussed this idea many times before on the show and privately, and the idea of this idea of making them have liability insurance. What made you guys actually want to start doing this and gave you originally the idea to do something like this?
Well, it comes from several things. A fellow who used to be the chair of our local Civilian Review Authority, CRA, had the idea and the thought, again, pretty much like you have, and we've been developing it. And it's really come to a head because the city is more and more obviously to everybody in the position where it's clear that it isn't even trying to do anything to bring the police under control. And so we have a necessity for doing it because other methods have just failed over and over. We also have an unusual opportunity because the conversation on this has changed, and I think probably not just in Minneapolis, but we had an election, a city election just recently, and usually any issues of public safety are discussions of how do we get more cops on the street, how do we give them more tools, how do we crack down? And most of the discussion, most of the questions the candidates were asked this time were, how do we bring our police force under control? We've already won half the argument. Pretty much everybody agrees our police force is out of control and that the city isn't doing anything about it, which makes this a really opportune moment for us to bring forward this thing, which, obviously we're not the only ones who thought about it. I'm glad you've been thinking about it. But this is a perfect time to do it. And we said, we got to do it. It's a huge amount of work. It's a big effort we're working on. But I think we, in this kind of environment, I think we have a real chance of doing it. We're having no trouble getting people to sign the petition. I mean, it's tough to get enough petitioners out there to get all those signatures, but the people we approach, the great majority, are happy to sign it. They immediately say, yeah, we need something like that. So we are not having much trouble convincing, folks on the street that this is a good idea and that it should go on the ballot. But we'll have opposition, and that's a big project to do. So.
All right. Well, I got to do a quick reminder to any of our live listeners that our phone lines and Skype are open. If you guys have any questions for Eric or, was it Dave, right?
Dave, that's right, yes.
Dave, okay. About this policy they're introducing, our phone number is 567-314-9296. Or you can Skype call in FPRN Radio Live. You can add them on your contacts there. They'll add you back, and we'll get you on the show. Other than that, I know we have a few more questions ourselves. I think we're chatting here in the chat. We got quite a few questions ourselves, so we'll just keep going here.
Awesome.
Yeah, one thing that I was kind of curious about was, if this, the cop loses the court case, there's still fees that are associated with that, and where the people, the taxpayers would have to pay for the attorneys. Have you guys thought about anything involving having them pay for those additionally, or?
Right. The officer actually should be liable for that also. The city might provide representation up to the point where it's determined that the officer has personally gone beyond the boundaries. But up until then, the city might provide some attorneys at first. Our state law, and I have a feeling most state laws, require that the city provide representation as well as liability coverage for the officers. Again, but there is, like in every one of those different situations, there is a but in the state law, and that says when they are operating within the scope of their employment. And so if it's determined by the court that they are not, then it becomes the responsibility of the officer for both the liability costs and for the costs of his defense, and that would be paid by the insurance company. As in most suits, you don't know when you go in who's going to pay whose lawyer's fees. But in the end, that all gets sorted out as part of the judgment. Or very often there's a settlement long before it goes to court, and that would have the same effect as well.
So what would prevent the police from just giving themselves more compensation to pay for this?
We say in our language that the city may pay the base rate for the insurance, but that any additional costs due to the officer's own actions, in other words, complaints against that officer or previous settlements or court judgments against the officer, any additional would be premium caused by that would be paid by the officer himself. So the officer is not disciplined by having to pay the whole, $500,000 judgment, which he can't possibly, and the poor victim wouldn't get anything. But immediately they have to start paying higher premiums eventually, and the city is prohibited from paying those extra amounts of premium. It's in our language. And eventually, of course, they become uninsurable. It's just like car insurance. There's a base rate for, an average driver. And, of course, the rate would be different for an officer working on the desk versus an officer on the SWAT team, certainly. But that would be the base rate, and that would be paid by the city, just as your car insurance might vary depending on where you live or how many miles you drive. But then your car insurance also, obviously, if you have a couple of accidents, your premiums go up. And if you're a really bad driver, you'll never be able to afford insurance again. And that's what we hope will be the case with these, we know would be the case with these officers. We can think of a dozen officers easily on the force that just would be absolutely uninsurable. No insurance company in their right mind would let these guys go out in the street with them covering them for liability.
All right, so my question is, do you guys have anything set up in the language that would keep them from subsidizing and causing the taxpayers to go ahead and pay for that anyways?
Yes, we basically do. The officers are required to maintain continuous coverage. Let me see. The city may reimburse officers for the base rate, but officers must be responsible for any additional costs due to personal or claims history. And that's where, under this, the city, the details of this, of course, would be negotiated, and the city would have to pass various ordinances as how this works. This is a basic provision in the city's charter, which is like the Constitution. But that prohibits the city from paying that extra. So I think we're pretty well covered on that. But it's been a tough job to come up with language which can't be subverted or worked around. And so we spent a lot of time on that, of course, because we know that so many very, very well-intentioned efforts to bring the police under control wind up being subverted. So those are important questions.
Excellent. Do you guys have anything that requires the chief of police to carry the same insurance as well?
Good question. I think he would be covered the same, or he or she, in our case it's a woman right now, would be covered pretty much in the same way. Yeah, and the chief of police can do... Hey, we had a police chief just about a year ago who actually walked across some people who were blocking entrance to a house that Occupy Homes was trying to save from eviction. The other officer stepped over them, and our chief of police, right on camera, right there, stepped right on the people's laps and on their shoulders to get into the house, just to be nasty. So I guess that could be an issue, couldn't it?
That's a good question.
Excellent. And then one more. Have you guys actually approached the chief and got him on board, or her on board with you doing this, or you guys doing this more of a separately?
We have not yet really contacted the police. We do want to open up some conversations there, because for many officers, this would be a good situation for them, because officers do know that occasionally they could wind up being responsible under state law, but the reality is that it almost never happens. But they could be responsible, and this insurance covers them anyway. Also, I would love to see something just like, good drivers get a good driver discount on their insurance. I'd love to see it that the insurance was set up so that officers without complaints or settlements actually get some money back in their pocket. I think it would be a great thing. For most officers, I think this would be an actual benefit. And there are some who it would not. But we know that the city knows who the bad officers are and doesn't want to do anything about them. And the police union is the same. They know who the bad officers are, and they don't want to do anything about them because those bad officers are awfully useful for situations, like strikes and protests and things, but also much more commonly and every day for pushing crime into certain areas, for getting so-called undesirable elements out of other areas, for clearing up certain areas, for redevelopment, for helping, realtors, like the white flight from the cities, that was pushed by realtors for their interests, but the police, went along with that. Police who are supposedly out of control are actually very useful to some of the people who really run the city behind the scenes. So that I don't expect that we'll ever get buy-in from the majority of the politicians or from the police federation, but we certainly would welcome support from individual officers and from people of goodwill who want to see police doing the job that they're supposed to do.
So have you guys looked into any of the insurance models that say govern? I'm sure that armed security guards and whatnot, they're covered by liability insurance and whatnot. So what kind of requirements do those insurance companies require of the people that they're insuring, such as like education and further training to make sure that the insurance company is protected from paying out all these lawsuits that may arise?
Yeah, that's an important point. Most security guards of that nature are insured entirely by their employer. And most of them don't have too many claims beyond that. They're usually not the cowboys we see on the police force. Obviously, as you know, there are exceptions. But in general, in those cases, if somebody costs their employer money, I have a feeling they get fired. So it's not quite the same as the, actual government-employed police force in that sense. There are some people who have insurance like that. We have just recently heard from some people, an ex-FBI officer out in California, about liability insurance that the individual FBI agents carried that protected them, and it was explicit, went for any incidents that are beyond the scope of their employment or beyond the scope of their duties as an FBI officer. So exactly the kind of things that this would cover. And apparently the FBI, it was fairly reasonable, and the FBI officers actually liked having this insurance and felt it was important to protect them. So there is a precedent there that we're looking into more. But this would, create a somewhat new market for insurance of this type. And we've had some discussions with some insurance companies, but that's continuing. And is a difficult area, as any time when you're tackling something new like this.
So there's a question out of the chat room. Somebody is asking if there is anything being addressed towards getting paid administrative leave, or basically a free vacation if you do something wrong.
Wow. Well, that's kind of separate from this proposal in that sense. Because I have a feeling the city would, even with this, keep the officer on paid administrative leave until it's settled, and there's a settlement or there's a judgment in court. But boy, that's something that's terribly abused also, and something, the organization that initiated this, Communities United Against Police Brutality, would be more involved in tackling something like that, which you're right, I mean, is a terrible abuse.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see that if they are found liable for whatever, that money is given back to the taxpayer, and the insurance would have to cover it.
That should certainly be part of the settlement. Yes. Yes, definitely. That would make sense. Just as the city might start off by representing them in the lawsuit, but if they're found guilty, then the insurance company has to pay those lawyer fees. And I think that paying back that pay while they're off duty is perfectly reasonable. We have very little guidelines to see how that goes, because no officer in Minneapolis ever winds up not going to work. I mean, we've had, as I say, millions of dollars in payouts. There are officers who have been responsible for over $1 million in claims, some of them while they were working off duty, and yet the city pays it anyway, and yet they are actually promoted. So a situation where an officer is fired or even criminally charged, heaven forbid, based on what they've done on duty, is virtually unheard of. So there really isn't much of a model for that, at least here in Minneapolis, and I suspect most other places. There are some officers who are fired, but most of them are fired for things like drinking on the job, or some criminal behavior off the job, or just being late for work, and all the other kind of things like any of us could get fired for. That happens. But fired for misconduct that affects the public, virtually unheard of.
Now I know we got at least one more question out of the chat. Was hold on, my mouse isn't working here. Okay, what would you recommend for others that wanted to start up something like this in their state or their city? How would they go about starting this and drafting something like this?
Well, I think the first big thing to do would be to try to connect with local organizations in that state that are tackling like police brutality, or who are advocating for police accountability. Because other than that, I think with that, all that experience of that activism, like Dave said, it was several minds coming together who've been working on this issue, saying, well, what could be some preventative measures? So that's something I would suggest. But
yeah. Also, of course, I'd suggest that they visit our website, which is CFPP MPLS .wordpress.com. And CFPP, Committee for Professional Policing, MPLS, of course, is short for Minneapolis. So CFPP, MPLS.wordpress.com, and get some information there. There's contact information for us, of course. Now, we're somewhat limited in how much assistance we can give to other people because obviously we have a big uphill battle here right in Minneapolis. And the best thing we can do for people is to get this in practice here and show that it works, as I believe it will. But yes, we are certainly looking for other people who are interested, people who have ideas that can help us, bouncing this back and forth between different cities with some different state law structures and different experiences, I think would help develop the idea for a more nationwide rollout. And we've been really impressed with, we put a couple of articles out locally, and suddenly we're hearing from people across the country with questions and interest in this. So I think this is something that could really take off, and it's great to see. We're all, every city, we are all. I used to be on the local Civilian Review Authority here, and I even attended the national conference at one point. What a bunch of frustrated people. I mean, there are so many people who are trying to do something, and it is so incredibly frustrating. Just stymied at everything. Not appointing people to the commission. The chief never does the discipline they recommend. Just on and on and on. That makes it so hard for any kind of civilian of oversight of law enforcement to actually work in the sense of actually disciplining officers to the point where the behavior of the police force as a whole is changed, and that those particularly bad officers are never seen on the street again and are fired as they should be. So this has been a tremendously difficult thing for anybody to accomplish. So I think people are looking for a new idea out there.
Wonderful. Well, we got about a minute left, and I think we're out of questions. So if you have any parting words for our listeners.
I definitely would like to encourage everybody to go to our website, which Dave mentioned, cfppmpls.wordpress.com. There's a lot more detailed information on there about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how folks can get involved. There's also the option of donation if folks are across the country but would still like to support our campaign. And other than that, definitely anybody feel free to email us, give us a call. We have all our contact information on the website if there are any questions or concerns. So we'd be really happy to talk to folks.
And thank you for having us on the program and for the work that you do. We're all working together on a common problem here.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. That's Eric Schiltz and David Bicking from the Community for Professional Policing out of Minneapolis, and I'll put the link to their website in the show notes, so that will be up probably sometime mid-afternoon tomorrow.
Yeah, I just threw it up in the chat, so it's available there. And I wanted to give a quick thanks to them, too, for responding back to my email that I sent them and coming on the show.